I wasn't looking for connections between European royalty and Tartaria, but then I found the photographs from the period depicting formal court gatherings. Standard fare initially, dignified poses, elaborate costumes, the usual trappings of hereditary power. But one image, preserved without explanation in a university archive, contained something I couldn't immediately place. A detail that seemed innocuous until I began comparing it to other photographs, then another, then dozens more. At first glance, nothing seems out of place. Royal families across Europe documented in their ceremonial regalia, the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, various German principalities, British nobility, standard historical record. Until you linger on certain details that repeat with disturbing consistency across completely separate lineages, separated by thousands of miles, with supposedly no direct connection to one another. The symbols were identical. Not similar, identical. And this is the most peculiar part. These weren't the well-known heraldic devices we associate with European monarchy. These were something else entirely. Emblems that appear in no official coat of arms, patterns that show up in the background of formal portraits, woven into carpets beneath their feet, embroidered onto garments that seem ceremonial but belong to no documented tradition. The further I went, the more these patterns emerged, not occasionally, not coincidentally, but systematically across royal families that claimed entirely separate origins. Images from the era that show aristocratic families. One of many forgotten photographs, this one from a collection of Russian nobility. The image hints at something, possibly a ceremonial gathering, though the context is never explained. What's documented, however, is the presence of architectural elements in the background. Specific architectural elements, the same elements appear in photographs of Spanish nobility from the same period, and Austrian aristocracy, and certain families in the Ottoman court. This prompts a straightforward yet vital question. How did aristocratic families across 3 continents, supposedly distinct in origin and culture, end up displaying identical architectural motifs in their private estates? Not the general style, not the broad aesthetic, but specific designs down to the geometric precision of certain decorative patterns that appear nowhere in the documented architectural traditions of their respective regions. The sanctioned explanation falls apart at this point. We're told these families developed independently, that their customs, their symbols, their architectural preferences emerged from separate cultural traditions, that any similarities are mere coincidence or the result of later cultural exchange. But the photographs suggest otherwise. A surviving print from the time shows what appears to be a private ceremony. The location is unidentified. The participants wear regalia that doesn't match any documented European order of knighthood. And in the background, visible if you know what to look for, are inscriptions. Text in a script that appears in no official records of these families. The same script appears in photographs from estates thousands of miles apart. Not similar characters, the exact same letter forms. The pattern resurfaces with disturbing exactness in royal family trees themselves. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These are stories that require deep archival work, and your support makes this research possible. The marriage patterns are what caught my attention first. European royal genealogy is well documented. We know which families intermarried, when, and for what political purposes. The Habsburg jaw, the haemophilia that plagued Victoria's descendants. These are the results of documented inbreeding, of calculated political alliances that prioritize power over genetic diversity. But there's another pattern beneath the surface, one that doesn't appear in the standard histories. Between 1720 and 1850, a specific subset of European royal families, families that, according to official records, had minimal prior connection, suddenly began intermarrying with remarkable frequency. Not the expected alliances, not the marriages that made political sense. but unions that seemed almost choreographed to preserve something else entirely. Bloodlines. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a wedding portrait. The couple is unnamed in the archive. The photograph itself is labelled only with a year, 1847, and a vague geographic designation. What's notable isn't the couple themselves, but who stands behind them. Witnesses, presumably. Their attire suggests high nobility, but their faces show features that don't quite match the ethnic background one would expect for that region. This wasn't an isolated case. The further I dug into genealogical records, the more I found marriages that made no political sense, but perfect genetic sense, if the goal was to preserve a specific genetic heritage. Families that claimed pure German lineage suddenly marrying into supposedly pure Russian lineage, but when you trace their maternal lines back far enough, both converge on the same geographic origin. The Eurasian steppes, the regions historically associated with Tartaria. Photographs of the period depicting what appear to be official gatherings. A frame preserved without explanation shows assembled nobility, perhaps 30 individuals arranged in formal rows. The image is undated, the location unspecified in the archive notes. What's documented is that the photograph was deliberately defaced at some point after its creation. Not destroyed. Defaced. Specific faces scratched out with precision. Not random vandalism. Targeted erasure. And that's precisely where this becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The defaced photographs follow a pattern. Across multiple archives in multiple countries, I found portraits where specific individuals had been methodically removed from the historical record. Not the entire photograph, not damaged by time or accident, but careful, deliberate scratching that obliterated faces while leaving the rest of the image intact. Who were they erasing? The archives offer no explanation. The photographs are catalogued without context. But when you find the same pattern of erasure across family collections separated by national borders, you begin to realise this wasn't isolated preservation damage. This was coordinated memory elimination. Between 1850 and 1880, something changed. The marriages stopped. The symbols disappeared from official portraits. The architectural elements that had appeared so consistently in aristocratic estates were removed, painted over, or demolished entirely. And the families who had displayed these connections so prominently just decades earlier suddenly claimed no knowledge of them. The silence was overwhelming. Not gradual forgetting, not the natural fade of historical memory, but abrupt, total silence, as if an entire dimension of aristocratic identity had been collectively agreed to never exist. Images from the era that show archive rooms. One of many administrative photographs from the period, this one possibly from a state library or royal collection. The image hints at something, possibly routine cataloguing work, though no specific explanation accompanies it. What's visible are rows of bound volumes, standard record keeping of the time, except many of those volumes no longer exist. I started tracking gaps in royal genealogical records, not random gaps, systematic ones, specific date ranges where documentation should exist, where the bureaucratic machinery of monarchy would have demanded documentation, but where the historical record goes mysteriously silent. The pattern is consistent. Between 1853 and 1857, birth records for certain noble lineages simply stop. Not everywhere, not all nobility, but specific families, the same families whose portraits showed those repeated symbols. Their official documentation becomes sparse, contradictory, or entirely absent for a window of 3 to 5 years. Then it resumes, as if nothing happened. This prompts a straightforward yet vital question. How do you lose the birth records of royal children during the most bureaucratically meticulous period of European history? These weren't peasant families. These were aristocrats whose every christening, every title, every inheritance required mountains of documentation for legal purposes. Yet the records don't exist, or rather, they don't exist anymore. Because here's what I found. In catalogue systems, in archival indexes, in old library records, there are references to documents that should exist. Genealogical volumes listed in 1840s, catalogues, family histories mentioned in correspondence, official state records referenced in other official state records. But when you try to access them, they're gone. Not lost to fire or flood, not damaged by time, just absent, withdrawn from circulation, missing from collections. And when you ask archivists about them, you get the same response. No record of their removal, no explanation for their absence, just bureaucratic shrugs and blank stares. The evidence points to something far more expansive than poor record keeping. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a private estate. Photographs of the period depicting grand buildings, though the specific location remains unidentified in the collection, the structure itself seems unremarkable at first. Another example of aristocratic excess, another monument to hereditary wealth. Until you notice what's been covered up. Not demolished, not removed, covered, layer upon layer of architectural modification designed to obscure something that was already there. And this is where the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Across Europe, across Central Asia, across estates owned by these same interconnected families, buildings show identical patterns of alteration during the exact same time period, the 1860s. One of many forgotten photographs from a German estate shows exterior walls that have clearly been modified, new facades added over older structures, windows bricked up and new ones cut in different positions, ornamental elements that don't match the underlying architecture awkwardly grafted onto surfaces. The modifications aren't improvements, they're concealment. The pattern resurfaces with disturbing exactness in Russia, in Austria, in estates across the Ottoman territories. Buildings that had stood for decades, sometimes centuries, suddenly underwent massive architectural alterations that served no apparent functional purpose. They were hiding the original designs, but why? A surviving print from the time shows what might be described as a council or gathering. At first glance, nothing seems out of place until you linger on the timing. Another photograph from a completely separate collection in a different country shows what appears to be an almost identical gathering. Same number of participants, same formal arrangement, same symbolic elements visible in the background. A third photograph, different archive, different continent, same exact period, same configuration. How? How did aristocratic families across Europe, the Ottoman Empire and the Russian territories coordinate gatherings with identical symbolic elements in the same year, decades before reliable international communication? Not the general idea of a formal gathering, but specific details, the arrangement of participants, the ceremonial objects visible in the frames, even the architectural settings that repeat with impossible precision. The sanctioned explanation gives way at this point. We're supposed to believe these are coincidences, that aristocratic families independently arrived at identical ceremonial practices in the same year despite having no documented communication with each other, that the symbols, the settings, the precise arrangements are simply the result of shared European culture. But the mathematics don't work. The probability of this occurring naturally, without coordination, without a shared tradition, without a common origin, it approaches zero, not unlikely, impossible. Photographs of the period depicting what appear to be interior rooms. One of many administrative images shows what might be a private library or study, bookshelves visible in the background, though the specific collection is unidentified. The image itself is unremarkable except for one detail. It's dated to 1863. That library no longer exists. According to estate records, it burned in 1864. A tragic accident, candle left burning, entire collection lost. I found documentation of 17, though possible more, major private library fires in aristocratic estates between 1863 and 1870. 17 libraries belonging to families whose portraits showed those symbols, whose marriages followed those patterns, whose buildings underwent those modifications. 17 accidents in 7 years, each destroying collections that had survived for generations. The sanctioned explanation falls apart at this point, because here's what the insurance records show. These weren't general fires that consumed entire buildings. These were fires localized to library spaces, fires that somehow destroyed book collections while leaving the surrounding rooms largely intact. Fires that were never investigated despite the immense value of what was lost. What was in those books? What knowledge was so dangerous that it required burning rather than simply hiding? And who coordinated the timing? Because that timing, that 7-year window of systematic destruction, suggests something far more deliberate than a series of unfortunate accidents. An image that wasn't meant to stand out shows what appears to be a planning meeting or consultation. Several men in formal attire, possibly architects or engineers, though their identities are not recorded. The photograph is one of several from a collection donated anonymously to a university archive decades ago. These are the men who would have known, the architects who designed these estates, who supervised the modifications, who sealed the basements and covered the facades, and witnessed the removal of those geometric patterns that connected these buildings to something older. They left no records, not one published account, not one private letter describing the work, not one architectural drawing that survived in professional archives. The men who spent years, sometimes decades, working on these aristocratic estates apparently never documented what they built, what they modified, what they were paid to conceal, or their documentation was removed as thoroughly as everything else. The evidence points to something far more expansive than architectural trends or aristocratic vanity. These buildings were physical manifestations of the same heritage, visible in the bloodlines, the same knowledge encoded in those symbols, the same tradition that connected royal families to territories and peoples that official history claims they had no connection to. And when that heritage became dangerous to acknowledge, the buildings themselves became targets, sealed, modified, burned, buried, systematically erased from the landscape just as thoroughly as the genealogical records were erased from the archives. Photographs from the period depicting what appear to be the final generation. Images from the era that show children, presumably royal children, though their identities are often unspecified in the archives. One of many forgotten photographs shows a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, wearing formal attire that suggests nobility. The image hints at something in her features, possibly an ethnic mixture uncommon for claimed lineage, though such observations remain speculative. These children would be the last generation to carry whatever bloodline had been so carefully preserved. By 1900, the patterns disappear entirely. No more symbols in the backgrounds, no more mysterious marriages between geographically distant families, no more architectural anomalies in aristocratic estates. The bloodline, if that's what it was, either died out or went so far underground that it became completely invisible to historical documentation. But here's what haunts me. What were they preserving? Not just any aristocratic lineage. The European royal families already had their documented lineages, their well-established bloodlines. This was something else, something they worked for over a century to maintain, something they displayed proudly in their private portraits and estates, something they were willing to erase completely from public memory when the time came. What knowledge did these bloodlines carry? What heritage was so important to preserve in secret, yet so dangerous to acknowledge openly? The photographs don't answer these questions, they only pose them. They show us what was, briefly, carefully, deliberately, and then they show us its systematic erasure. The symbols painted over, the records removed, the faces scratched from history, the marriages that stopped as abruptly as they began, the children who would be the last to carry something forward into a world that would never know what they carried. I look at these photographs now, the ones that survived the purge, the ones that slipped through the cracks of erasure. and I see fragments of something larger, a network that spanned continents, a coordination that shouldn't have been possible, a heritage that connected royal families to something older, something that preceded their official lineages, something that pointed back to the vast territories we now call Tartaria. And I wonder, what else was erased? What other bloodlines carried this forward? And most importantly, did it truly end, or did it simply learn to hide more effectively? The archives hold no answers, only more questions, only more fragments of a pattern that once connected the most powerful families in the world to a history we're no longer permitted to remember. The photographs remain, silent, defaced, catalogued without context, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. I'm still looking, and the more I find, the less I understand, and the more certain I become that this absence, this carefully constructed silence, is itself the loudest evidence of all.